If your podcast disappeared tomorrow, would your business actually feel it? And I don't mean emotionally, but structurally. Would something in your business stop working or moving because you stopped? Or would you only be missing content? Because if the answer is nothing really would happen, then your podcast is functioning as content, not a business decision. And those are two very different functions. Your podcast should function as a decision before it functions as content. Most podcasters don't grow because they don't have a strategy. No more. Welcome to the show, Podcast to Grow, where I help coaches and entrepreneurs turn their podcast into their most powerful business tool. I'm Elena, and I'm breaking down exactly how to get more listeners, more impact, and more sales. Let's get into it. When I started to record this season, I thought it was going to be focused on making podcast launches more potent, stronger. I also thought I was going to be having more podcast audits on here to show you what kind of things you could change to make those tweaks for your podcast. And it also was about getting a ROI from your podcast and making your podcast better. That was my original idea. But as I moved through the season, I was seeing patterns, and I had already seen those patterns, but I no longer could ignore those patterns that I was seeing. And I had to change what I was talking about because I know that those tactics can help and work, but they are not going to work on the deeper level, the structural level of the podcast. Because every stuck podcast I see has the same issue. And the issue isn't content or effort. It is a decision. It's that a decision has not been made. So the real question I ask now is, what role is your podcast playing inside of your business? Because effort multiplies the decision that already exists. I see this with podcasters all the time. They believe that their show is doing everything right. They're publishing weekly. They're promoting episodes. They're getting all of their clips out there, and they are consistent with their show. Why is it not working? And they wonder why it's not moving, because their downloads are staying in a similar range. They're not seeing an increase in conversations or conversions, and there's no clear connection to revenue for them. And it's starting to create a frustration with them. And most of the time, that isn't an effort problem. That is a decision problem. When your podcast feels heavy, it's because it's not just a content channel or a marketing arm or a visibility tool. And it's definitely not something that you're casually trying if this is part of your business. When it isn't treated that way, it starts to feel heavy because you are just trying to keep up with it as content or utilizing it in a way that it wasn't structurally set up for. And that feels frustrating. And you start questioning things like, why isn't this working? What am I doing wrong? Why does this feel so disconnected from my offers? Why is my audience not engaging? Why are they not seeing what I'm doing or the value that I'm providing for them? Why am I even publishing and not seeing any progression? That's because you're treating the podcast like output instead of a structural choice. When something just exists inside the business, it drains more than it can give. I see podcasts all the time that slowly turn into weekly obligations. The episodes go out, The promotion pieces are created and scheduled. The social posts are made. And maybe there's possibly even some newsletters that go out or newsletter mentions. And then the whole process repeats every week. And that is heavy and exhausting because you have to keep feeding it so it stays alive. And this is usually when someone starts thinking, why am I even doing this? Why do I keep adding to this? I'm not seeing anything in return. Something else I noticed is how often podcasters feel the pressure to reinvent their shows. Maybe once a year or every few months, they decide that they need to make some kind of change. Maybe a rebrand, maybe they need to change their artwork or change the music in their episodes or don't do music. They're making these small tweaks and thinking that that one thing is going to make that difference that will eventually get their show in front of the right people and take their show to where they wanted it to be. But underneath all of those adjustments, the role of the podcast was never decided. So the show keeps changing and evolving because the structure underneath was never decided in the first place. Choosing a role requires trade-offs. Real business decisions require trade-offs as well. Once you are deciding what your podcast is for, you're also deciding what it is not. Here's some examples. If the role is visibility, then the job is reach and exposure. It may not convert directly. If the role is authority, its job is reinforcement and recognition. It may not explode downloads. If the role is nurture, its job is trust and decision support. It may grow slower but warmer. The problem becomes clear when someone does not make that choice and they expect it to be reach, conversion, and authority all at once. And they are left disappointed because it's not doing all of these things for them. These trade-offs don't weaken your podcast. They actually stabilize it. I also see podcasts that are getting great amount of downloads, but the podcaster is not feeling like it is. Their audience is there. Their episodes are being listened to, but the host is feeling frustrated because they're not seeing that the downloads are turning into inquiries. And the assumption becomes, I'm doing something wrong with my podcast. But often what is happening is much simpler than that. The podcast is functioning as a visibility channel, but it's being measured as a nurturing system. So the audience is growing, but they are not converting because the structure underneath is not set up to move them to the next step. When the role and the expectations don't match, the podcast will always feel like it's unsuccessful. If this episode is helping you realize that you have never defined the role of your podcast, you are not alone. This is usually the missing layer. And I actually created a diagnostic guide to help you with this. It is called The 3 Signals Your Podcast is Structurally Under Leveraged. Inside, it goes through 3 signals. Authority is not expanding. Revenue is not connecting. The podcast is publishing without a structural position. Because most podcasters don't stall because they have bad content. They stall because the structure was uncertain from the beginning. You can find the link to the diagnostic guide under this show episode title. So you'll find it right in the episode description. Now, when you enter in, go through it slowly. Name what your podcast is currently optimized for and what it is not. And if you run through it and you realize that the role of your podcast still isn't clear, this is the kind of work that I do inside of my Foundation and Visibility Strategy session. And also the link will be in the description for that as well. If you've been listening through the season, I hope one thing has shifted for you. I hope you have stopped asking, how do I make this work? And you start asking, what am I building this for? That question changes everything. I'll be back in late spring with season 3. And next season, we are going to go deeper into positioning, deeper into structural strategy, deeper into what it means to produce a podcast that actually compounds, not one that just circulates. Until then, I hope you treat your podcast like the decision it is, not an experiment. I'll see you then. This has been a great season. I hope you've enjoyed it. If today's episode has you questioning whether your podcast has a direction or not, I have something for you. If your podcast has been active for 6 to 12 months, but it isn't influencing authority, revenue, or bringing qualified leads your way, that isn't effort, it's structure. Most business owners try to fix this with better content, stronger call to actions, or more visibility. But without defining the podcast's primary responsibility inside the business, effort multiplies without compounding. This diagnosis will help you identify whether authority is plateauing, whether revenue is disconnected, whether positioning is undefined, because you can chase tactics, but it will never clarify the role of your podcast for you. You'll find the link to this guide in the episode description.